Hey, and welcome back. In this lesson, we're gonna start the tracking process. So basically what we're gonna do is we need to add trackers and track some features in the shot. Now, we basically need 8 good tracks to solve this camera movement. Now, it's very important that you get the best tracks that you can possibly get. If you have, for instance, 8 or 9, or let's say you have 10 good tracks, but you have one bad track, that one bad track can actually mess up your camera tracking results completely. So it's always good to have rather less trackers, but good tracks, than having a lot of trackers, but you have some bad tracks, if that makes sense. So yeah, so basically minimum required tracks is 8. If you think of a cube, the cube has got 8 points. So you've got 4 points at the top and 4 at the base. And that's basically how tracking works. So we need some points on the floor and some points maybe far in the distance, and then also maybe some points closer to camera. And then we also want some points that's not on the floor. So maybe on the where the roof is, maybe, and maybe some of these windows on the front section of this building, and maybe just some of the corners of the buildings as well. The more trackers you have at specific points in your shot, the easier it will be to kind of reconstruct the scene in 3D space. But you will see what I mean when we get to that. So the most important thing to note or to remember is you need at least 8 tracks that's going through the footage completely. So those 8 tracks must cover all the frames of your footage, and it's always better to have less but good tracks than having a lot of tracks that's not as good. And yeah, you're looking for high contrast points that we can track. So make sure that you are on frame 1. You can either just scrub this timeline here at the bottom to go to frame 1, or you can use the keyboard shortcut shift and then the left arrow on your keyboard, and that will jump to the first frame. So the shortcut to go to the last frame is shift and the right arrow key on your keyboard. So we're going to use that shortcut quite a lot, so try and get familiar with it. So shift and left to jump to the first frame, and now we're going to look for our first feature that we're going to track. So for the first track, we're going to leave the motion model on location, but we can experiment with these other ones as we go through this tracking process. So make sure this is set to location. We've got our pattern size set to 40, search size is set to 71, everything's looking good. I'm on frame 1, and I'm going to kind of zoom in around the footage and look for something to track. So I think let's start with a point that's on the floor plane, so on the floor of the scene, and I want to maybe track this edge of this building right here, so maybe this area right there. So to place a new tracker, you simply hold Control and then just click once, and that's going to create that tracker for you. You can now also go ahead and you can kind of drag around to reposition that tracker, and here on the left hand side under the track tab here on the side, you can also see the tracker just kind of in a close-up view here. You can also click and drag here to do some fine readjustments for the position of that track, and once you are happy to track forward, we are going to, you can either use the keys here at the bottom or these buttons. You can press this one that says track the selected markers forward for the entire clip, but we're going to use the shortcut keys because it's just so much easier. Now the shortcut for track forward is Control and T for track. So press Control T on your keyboard and you're going to see it's going to kind of jump out of view. If we zoom out, you can see that the tracker is still on that corner of the building, and if I scrub through here, you can see the tracker is sticking to that point. Now we can see here in this top corner this preview of that track. If I scrub through, you can see the track point is actually kind of moving a bit there. It's not staying exactly on that corner of that building, and that's because the perspective is actually changing a bit. This wall image here on the side, you can see that it's actually changing, and that's a perspective change. So for this track, location is not really going to be the best option to use, so I'm going to go ahead and delete this tracker and let's retrack it using a different motion model. So to delete a track, simply click on it or click next to it to select it, and then press X and delete track. So now we're going to create a new track, but we're first going to change the motion model. And for this one, I want to try either perspective or affine. So I think for this one, let's go with affine. So just select affine there. Make sure you're on the first frame, very important. Zoom in here and place the first tracker by holding Control and click once. You can see the preview in the top corner. And now I'm going to track forward again, so pressing the shortcut Control T. Alright, so now you can see that our tracker actually kind of changed perspective. You can see if I scrub through that, it kind of goes from a square to kind of more like a flat square. Now if you look at this little preview in the corner, if I scrub through that, you can see the tracker is staying on that corner exactly. And that's because the perspective changed, so we changed our motion model to affine or affine. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but yeah, you can see it's tracking much better. So that's a really, really good track. So if you go to the last frame, you can see it's perfectly on that corner. If we go to the first frame, it's perfectly on the corner, and everything in between. So we have one track that's perfect basically. So let's save our project, and I just quickly want to show you, if we drag this down here at the top, you can see all the trackers here as well. So there's going to be a list of all your trackers here, and you can also see that this first track is going all the way from frame 1 all the way through to frame 150. So this is just an easy way to see the duration of that track, because sometimes you can have a track that's only covering half of the frames. Maybe that feature goes out of the frame, and then you will only have this line kind of covering halfway of the shot. Now we need 8 tracks that's covering the full duration of the shot, but we can also have some that's only covering certain areas of the shot, but then we need more trackers, if that makes sense. Alright, so we have one tracker. Let's go ahead and place our second track. So for this one, I'm going to zoom around and let's see what we can track. Maybe this corner of this panel here on the floor, and that's also on the floor, which is great, and we can see it stays inside the shot all the way through the 150 frames. So I'm going to go back to frame 1, shift and left arrow, and I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to place a tracker on this high contrast corner right here. So hold Control, click once. We've got a little preview here in the top corner, and I'm going to press Control T to track forward. And let's check this track. So keep an eye on this little preview here at the top corner. And if I scrub through this, you can see it's perfect. It stays on that corner, and that means we have a very good track. So now if we look at this window here at the top, you can see we've got 2 trackers, and both of them go all the way through the 150 frames, which is great. So here at the bottom, we've got this funny looking graph, and this basically just shows you the movement of all your tracks. So it basically shows you the up and down movement of these tracks, and later on you might see if we have a bad track, it will not follow kind of the default movement of the other tracks, because most of the trackers in your scene will kind of follow the same movement. Obviously not exactly the same, but they will kind of follow the same pattern. And you will easily see if there's something that kind of jumps out here, and then you know that track is not really a good track. But we'll get to that later, so don't worry about that graph too much for now. So we've got 2 good trackers. Let's place our third track. So go to frame 1 and let's zoom in and look for our third feature to track. So this one, I'm going to try and track this tree right here at the back. And you can see it's also on the floor plane, so that's good for now. So I'm going to track this corner right there. Alright, so you can see the little preview in the top window. Make sure on frame 1 and track forward by pressing Control T. Alright, so let's scrub through that, and that looks like a good track to me. Alright, so here at the top you can see we've got 3 tracks, and they're all the way through, which is great. So let's zoom out and find more features to track. Now we can also track from the backwards to the front. So let's go to the last frame. So press shift and right arrow to jump to frame 150, and let's zoom in and see what we can track. Maybe let's track this little white thing that's also on the floor plane. So I'm gonna control click on that corner, and now we want to track backwards. So because we're on frame 150, we're gonna track all the way back to frame 1. Now the shortcut for tracking backwards is Control, Shift and T. So remember, to track forward, it's just Control T. Track backwards, Control Shift T. So let's press that now, Control Shift T, and that's going to track all the way back to frame number 1. So we can scrub through this, keep an eye on this little preview window here at the top, and you can see that track is looking great. So here in the top window, you can see we've got 4 trackers and they're all going through the shot. So I want to quickly show you what happens if a feature leaves the shot. So you can see, let's look at this feature right here. If I scrub from the back forwards, you will see that it's going to leave our shot there. So I want to show you what happens when we actually track that, because sometimes we don't have enough features in the shot that covers all the frames, and then we have to track like little bits and pieces of frames even if they go outside the frame. So let me show you how that works. So I'm on frame 150, and you can see we've got this little high contrast feature right here that I want to track. Control and click to place that tracker, and now we want to track backwards. So I'm going to press Control Shift and T, and now you're going to see that our tracker actually stopped here at frame 108. So if I scrub through here from 150, you can see in this top corner it tracked that feature perfectly, and then suddenly it kind of just went all wonky and weird, and then it stopped tracking. Because of that feature, it's leaving the frame, so the tracker just couldn't track it anymore. So what we want to do is we want to tell Blender the last frame that tracker was actually good before it kind of went haywire. So you can use your arrow keys to kind of scrub through frame by frame, and if I go backwards to about frame 110, you can see this is where things started to kind of go weird. So I'm going to go forward to about frame 112, and now we want to delete any tracking data going backwards. So we want to keep the tracking data on this side from 150 to 112, but we want to delete everything going this way. So to do that, we can use either these icons on the left hand side, or you can use these icons here above the timeline. And what we want to do is we want to use the clear buttons. Now you'll see there's a clear backwards and also a clear forwards, and we want to clear everything that's this way, which is backwards. So you simply click on this little clear with an X and the one pointing backwards, and now you'll see that it's going to delete all the tracking data going this way. So this will just tell Blender that the last good tracking frame for this tracker was on 112, and there's nothing before that. So you just need to do that when your track goes out of the frame. So now if we look at this little window here at the top, if I just make that a bit bigger, you can see that our track number 4 is only this, it's only tracked on this area of frames. So it goes from 150 to 112, and then there's nothing before that. So that's perfect, but this won't count as one of the 8 trackers that we need. If we get another track now that's covering frames from 1 to 112, then those 2 tracks will count as one complete track, basically, because it needs to cover all the frames. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So I'm just going to move that up again, move this down, and let's try and look for more features. So let's go to frame number 1 by pressing Shift and the left arrow key. And this time I want to track something that's not on the floor plane. So maybe something on the building itself. So let's zoom in around here, and maybe this dark spot under this window, maybe we can track that feature. So on frame 1, hold in Control, click right there to place the tracker, and I'm going to track forward. So I'm going to press Control T to track forward. And let's scrub through and keep an eye on this top window to see if we have a good track. And you can see it's not bad. It's kind of changing a little bit of shape, but it looks like the tracker is kind of staying in relatively the same position. So I'm gonna leave that track, and yeah, I think that's a good track. So let's look at another point, also maybe something on the building itself. So maybe let's zoom in here, maybe this corner right here. So make sure you're on frame 1, place your tracker by holding Control, and now I'm going to track this one forward. So Control T to track forward, and that looks like a good track. Keep an eye on this window, quickly do a scrub through and make sure the track is sticking to that position, and yeah, that's looking good. So let's go ahead now and save our project. Alright, I also want to track the edge of the building here at the bottom, just so that we have a tracker in that position. So if we want to kind of rebuild the building, or we want those locations in 3D space, it's always good to then track them as well. So I'm going to track this corner right here. I'm going to place a tracker there on frame 1, and I'm going to track that forward by pressing Ctrl T. So you can see that looks like a good track. If I keep my eye on this little preview, that is sticking really well. So we've got another good track. So now we want to maybe track something that's farther away in the background, just to kind of help Blender figure out the perspective and everything and the movement of the shot. Basically, it's always good to have tracks that's closer to camera and also further away from the camera. So let's see what we can maybe track there at the back. Maybe I can track, let's just zoom in here and see what we have. Maybe I can track this fence. Some people maybe want to track that cow in the background, but always a very good rule of thumb is to never track something that moves. So you don't want to track any animals, you don't want to track any trees that's maybe blowing in the wind, or anything that's kind of moving. You don't want to track people, things like that. You want to track static objects. So I think let's zoom in here on frame 150, and I'm going to see if we can track this base of this fence pole. So I'm just going to simply hold Control, click there to place a tracker, and let's see how far we get until that fence goes out of the frame. So let's just do a track backwards now. So Control, Shift, and T, and you can see it actually went all the way through to frame 1. So let's keep an eye on this preview window and see what happened. Yeah, that looks like a really good track. Yeah, I'm happy with that. Alright, so let's look for more things to track. So I want to show you, when you track something where the background is changing a lot, you might get a failed track. So if we look at maybe this edge of the roof, this area right here. Now keep an eye on the surrounding pixels. If I drag my mouse, you can see that the surrounding pixels are changing completely because of perspective and the distance of the grass and everything behind the roof. So I'm going to try and track this section. I'm going to show you what happens when we have something like this. So make sure you're on frame 150, the last frame. I'm going to zoom in here, and I'm going to place my tracker on this corner right here. And now you can see our pattern is basically everything inside of this box. So it's going to look at these pixels on the roof, but it's also going to look at these pixels behind the roof, which will change. And that's going to basically confuse the tracker a bit, because the roof is going to stay exactly the same, but the background is going to change. So let's see what happens if we try and track this backwards. So I'm going to press Control, Shift, and T to track backwards, and you can see that our track failed. So if I scrub through this, keep an eye on this preview window, you can see that I just couldn't figure out where to keep that track. And that's because of the background is completely changing. So let me show you how to track something like that. So I'm going to go back to the last frame, 150. Make sure to delete this track. So simply click next to it to select it, press X and delete. And I'm going to place the tracker there as again at the same position. So hold Control and click there. But now you can kind of use these points to change the pattern. So I'm simply just going to kind of do something like this. And you don't want to include any of the pixels at the back. And you can also use this thing to kind of rotate it. And you can use, you can kind of just move it around. and maybe reposition these points. So this little point here in the middle, that's actually going to be the middle of the track. That's that crosshair right there. So you just want to kind of move these points around so it's not including those pixels at the back. So let's see if something like that might work. So I'm going to track backwards, Control Shift T, and that looks a lot better. So now if I scrub through this whole, keep an eye on this little preview, and you can see that is actually looking perfect. You can also see it here in the main preview or the video that it's tracking perfectly. So that's just a really good tip when tracking things where the background kind of changes. So yeah, we've got a good track there. So maybe let's track this window as well, so we have some tracking information where it is in the scene, which is always good. So let's go back to the first frame for this one. So shift and left click or left arrow to jump to frame number 1. And I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to track this corner of this window. So Control click, place the tracker, and simply Control T to track forward. And that's a real easy track, and you can see it's sticking perfectly. Okay, let's go back to frame 1, and I think we probably have enough trackers by now. We've got 10 trackers and 9 of them, or maybe 11 of them are going all the way through all the frames. So technically we do have enough trackers to basically solve our track. But as I mentioned earlier, it's always good to track features that you know you might actually want to use when rebuilding this scene in 3D. And that's why I did kind of the corner of the building, that corner of the building, so we know where those points in space will be in 3D space. So there's a few more that I want to add just so that we have enough tracking points to rebuild the scene basically. So I want to track this corner as well. Now we're going to have a similar issue where we track the roof, where the pixels behind the roof is moving quite strangely. Now if you keep an eye on this area here, you can see the background is moving a little bit different. It's revealing more of the grass and that pathway right there. So we want to make sure we track this correctly. So on frame number 1, I'm going to place my tracker on this corner, but I want to increase the tracking or the pattern, basically this to this side. Maybe let's just move it like that, and then we can kind of just reposition this. No, I actually want to place my tracker on the corner like that, but I want to move these points so it's not looking at those pixels right there. It's only looking at these pixels in front. All right, let's try that and see if it works. So Control T, and I did something. Let's scrub through, keeping an eye on this little preview. You can also look in the main window here. Yeah, that looks like a really good track. So now we have the corner of our building, the front corner, that one as well. So maybe we need this corner as well, so that we can, if we need to, we can then kind of rebuild this wall. If we want to maybe add something on this wall, then we have those points in 3D. So on the first frame, let's zoom in all the way to this area, and in that corner, add your tracker, Control click, and now we're going to track forward, Control T. And that looks like a good one. Let's keep an eye on this little track, scrub through, and yeah, you can see that is looking good. Okay, let's look around our scene and let's see if there's anything else that we want to track. Maybe we can track one of these electrical boxes here on this wall, and maybe I want to track just this top edge or this top corner of this electrical box. So on frame 1, I'm going to zoom in here, place a tracker right there, Control T to track forward, and let's see if we have a good track. Yeah, that's looking perfect. You can see it's sticking to that corner. And yeah, I think we have enough tracks now. We've got some tracks in the background, we've got some trackers on the ground, in the foreground, we've got some on the building. Maybe we can add like one more, maybe just one on this side somewhere. So we have a point in 3D where these windows are, if you want to do something in that area. important to kind of think of your end result and then place trackers where you want to add objects. Now, I'm not exactly sure what we're going to do with the shot yet, but I think if we have the ground plane and if we've got the basics of the building, then we should be fine. So I'm just going to zoom in on this side, make sure you're on frame number 1, and I'm going to track this corner of this window right there. So Control T to track forward, and that is looking good. Scrubbing through. Yeah, that's perfect. So now let's go ahead and save our project, and let's quickly look at our trackers. So you can see we have 15 trackers in total, and all of them except one go all the way through all the frames, the 150 frames, so that's great. And if you look at the graph here at the bottom, you can see they're kind of all moving in the same direction except this one, but this one is that track that we kind of stopped halfway through that went out of frame. So if I click on this, or just next to this graph, you can actually see that it's going to highlight that track in the shot. So if I just scrub over that area, you can see this white tracker that's been highlighted. That's the track that's kind of sticking out there, but it's fine because we only tracked it to there. It kind of looks a little bit different. So I think we've got really good tracks. So go ahead and save your project now, and I will see you in the next lesson.